So, as I mentioned in announcements, today is the first Sunday after Easter, which you knew, but as I was researching these passages, I came across this ancient tradition that claims that the first Sunday after Easter is Holy Humor Sunday. And the tradition goes back to the ancient church of the 4th century. And usually when we think of these ancient theologians of the 4th century, we don't think of humor, right? We think of seriousness. But they claimed that actually the whole weekend of Good Friday through Easter Sunday was kind of like a big divine joke. A good joke sets up our common expectations for how the world is and then flips it on its head. So in that spirit, on Holy Humor Sundays, pastors tell jokes. And sometimes they open it up to the congregation to tell jokes. Yes. But I have heard some of your jokes, especially coming from the male variety of the church, and thought that it wouldn't be a good idea to open the floor. So I can't resist, so I'll tell you a few jokes. But before I do, I need you to do me a favor and laugh hysterically at the end of each of these cheesy jokes. For two reasons. First, for you, because science tells us that laughter is good for the soul. It's good for the body. And a second reason is that as I tell these really corny jokes that might make you groan, but if you laugh instead, it will make me feel better about myself. Okay, it'll be good for me. So it'll be good for both of us, all right? So here we go. A priest, a rabbi, and a UCC pastor. You know this is a good one, right? We're off to a good start. Went fishing. They were out in the lake on a boat when the priest had to use the restroom. So he prayed, stepped out of the boat, and walked across the lake, did his business, and then came back. And when he came back, the rabbi decided, yeah, I need to go too. So he prayed, and then he stepped out of the boat and walked across the lake and came back. And when he came back, the UCC pastor decided he had to go too, so he knelt down in the boat and prayed, and then he stepped out of the boat and sunk all the way down to the bottom of the lake. And the rabbi looked to the priest and said, "You didn't tell him about the rocks?" Ann Duffy has heard this one before and said, the rocks, steps on the rocks. After worship one Sunday, a young boy told the pastor, "When I grow up, I'm going to give you some money." "Thank you," the pastor replied, "but why?" And the boy responded, "Because my daddy says that you are one of the poorest preachers we've ever had." Ouch, ouch. Okay, this is the last one. Okay, all right. And this, I think, is a good one. One Sunday, the pastor announced there would be a church board meeting after the service. When the service ended, the board met in the back of the sanctuary, but a visitor who was there for the very first time came to the board meeting. And the pastor said, "Hey, we're glad that you are so interested in the church, but this is just for those of us who are on the board." And the visitor said, "Oh yes, I know. And after today's sermon, I suppose I'm just about as bored as anyone else who came to this meeting." That's a little close, that one right there, yes. Ouch. Okay, so we got the cheesy jokes out of the way. Thank you for laughing at them, by the way. It was awesome. But there's still a question that we need to explore about Holy Humor Sunday. What did God do that the early Christian theologians think was so humorous? I mean, I think God has a sense of humor. After all, when I proposed to my wife, Carrie, she said she would marry me just as long as I never became a pastor. But soon I found myself working as a youth pastor at a UCC congregation, and we fell in love with it, and now here we are. And this brief history leads me to assume that God indeed has something of a sense of humor. But the spiritual leaders of the early church spoke of God less as a jokester and more as kind of a trickster. You might say God is a practical jokester. Like when my oldest son, Braden, started watching YouTube videos several years ago and found a practical joke channel. One video showed a man putting saran wrap over his family's toilet bowl. And yes, my oldest son tried that practical joke one morning before school, but fortunately for us, he couldn't stop laughing when he was in the bathroom. And so I knew he was up to no good. It was awesome. For the early church, God's practical joke was a little different from a 6-year-old's practical joke. They said that God's practical joke had to do with Christ's work on the cross and in the resurrection. Now, the Bible claims that on the cross, Jesus defeated the powers of evil and death. But the Bible doesn't really have a theory for how Jesus did that. So fairly quickly in history, church history, theologians began coming up with theories that we know of as atonement theories. Atonement is a strange word, but breaking it down into its parts helps us understand it a little better. Atonement essentially means at one meant. We are meant to be at one with God and with one another, and in some mysterious way, the cross and resurrection achieved that at one meant for humanity and God. But if you were like me, when you think of atonement, you probably don't think of humorous and playful practical jokes, do you? For many of us in the progressive church, the word atonement is like a 4-letter word. That's because the dominant understanding of atonement in the United States often goes like this. Humans sinned in the Garden of Eden. Ever since that original sin, God looked upon humanity with infinite wrath. And because God is infinitely holy and just, and sin somehow defiles God, so God is infinitely wrathful and needed an outlet to channel his, and it always seems to be his in this theory, wrath upon Jesus. Jesus says, as the Son of God, okay, Father, I'll take your wrath upon myself. And so in this scenario, Jesus has to save us from God. Jesus saves us from God. And this is penal substitutionary atonement theory. Jesus came to save us from God. Some people claim that this theory is the gospel, that Jesus came to save us from the wrath of God is good news, they say, and if you take it away, you take away the essence of Christianity. Now, when I was growing up and I heard this theory, something inside of me recoiled. Something protested inside of me. I was always taught that if God was infinite anything, it would be infinite love. So why, if God was infinite love, did Jesus have to save us from the infinite wrath of God? It didn't make sense logically to me. And you know what? It wouldn't have made sense logically to the early church either. That's because penal substitutionary atonement theory didn't get formed until the 16th century with a man named John Calvin and his followers. In fact, when I talk with my Catholic friends about this idea of God's wrath, they look with horror and call it a heresy. And that's because it is a heresy. Penal substitutionary atonement theory is the most egregious Protestant heresy that there is. But here's the good news. The early Christians didn't talk about atonement this way. They never would have said that Jesus went to the cross to save us from the wrath of God. Rather, they said that Jesus went to the cross to play a big, cosmic, practical joke that defeated the devil and death itself. Notice that for the early church, our biggest enemy was not God. We didn't need to be saved from God. We needed to be saved from the devil and death. God was not against humanity, but for our freedom from the powers of evil, including the powers of fear, the devil, and death. And so at his death and in his resurrection, Jesus was victorious over the powers of evil. The ancient theory is known as Christus Victor. To describe how Jesus was victorious over these powers of evil, the early church came up with a metaphor that seemed like a practical joke God played on the devil and death. They said it was like God went fishing, and Jesus was the bait. Death and the devil were ravenous fish who eventually swallowed everyone into its belly. But this theory says God tricked death and the devil by becoming fully human. The divinity of Jesus was hidden within the flesh and bones of his humanity. And so when the powers of evil swallowed up Jesus into death, the divinity within Jesus burst forth, conquering the fish. As with all metaphors, this one breaks down at certain points. But personally, I love it because of its playfulness. I love it precisely because of its near absurdity. I love it because, like a good joke, it flips my natural inclinations upside down. When I was growing up, if someone said to me, "Hey, Adam, explain how Christ was victorious over the powers of evil," I probably would have said something like, well, Jesus brought his divine army and went to war and was eventually victorious over the powers of evil. My Jesus would have had a cosmic battle where it went back and forth. Maybe it looked really bad for Jesus on Good Friday, right? But like all superhero movies, Jesus resurrects in the end and is victorious. I think this is the default position that most people have. To be victorious means to defeat our enemies in some kind of big battle. But that wasn't the case for the early church. They described it as God going fishing. God's cosmic defeat of the powers of evil, not through militaristic terms, but by an act of fishing. When I think about it that way, it's silly. There's a kind of absurdity to it. And the joke continues in the resurrection when the joke isn't on death and the devil, but the joke is on us. In our story from the Gospel of John today, the disciples are living in fear, as Charlie said, because their leader had just been killed. They locked themselves in a room because they are afraid that people who came after Jesus and killed him might come after them too. And then all of a sudden, the person they just abandoned and betrayed showed up in front of them. Jesus showed up to them. And did you notice that he said, "Peace be with you"? He didn't say it once. He didn't say it twice. He said it 3 times. He repeated the phrase, "Peace be with you." Why? Well, because they had just abandoned and betrayed Jesus. They left him alone to the cross. Jesus had to assert over and over again that even though they deserted him, he was not out to get them. There was no wrath within Jesus. He was not a ghost or a zombie out for violence or revenge. He was there to offer them peace. Do you see the playfulness in all of this? This is what holy humor is all about. God defeats evil not with violence, which would just add more evil and violence into the world. Rather, God defeats evil by something like an act of fishing, showing up in a locked room to tell people that they are loved. Jesus resurrects not to enact divine revenge on the people who deserved it, but to offer peace. That is how God creates atonement. But still, you and I know that evil and death are all around us today. Despite the claim that Jesus had defeated evil and death, the early Christians knew this too. Evil and death was all around them as well. In fact, they were often persecuted And I'm not talking about, hey, you need to bake a cake for your LGBTQ neighbors. That's not persecution. The early Christians were often killed for their faith. But they knew that because Jesus defeated the powers of evil and death, that evil and death don't have the last word. And so they stared evil in the face. They trusted that there was something bigger than death. And that power was resurrection. That power was God's love. And that power allowed them to live with a certain lightness and a sense of humor amidst a violent world. So we may wonder, what does this mean for us today? I think that it means we can take our fight for justice seriously, but we don't need to take ourselves too seriously. I think it means that we can work for justice with a sense of humor. Yes, the powers of evil and death are all around us. We know that the powers are still here when certain people claim that there's a caravan of Latin Americans coming to take over the United States. And then certain people make the claim that those Latin Americans are rapists and trying to enter the United States illegally. Those are the powers of evil and death. I'm sure you heard those claims earlier this week, and at first I was infuriated at the continual scapegoating of our Latin American siblings, but then I found some humor in the story. The claims were so ridiculous that a Breitbart reporter who covers border immigration stated that those claims were false. He reported that, in fact, those coming from Latin America are coming to a port of entry requesting refugee status, which is totally legal. No doubt, we need to continue our work for social justice, and I think it's important to hold a sense of humor as we do that work. A Breitbart reporter correcting a negative story on immigrants is a bit unexpected to me. There's a certain holy humor in that. It softens my heart as it flips my expectations upside down. And that's why I love this ancient atonement theory of Christus Victor. God flips my expectations upside down by defeating evil, not with bigger and more violent forms of evil, but by going fishing. It's kind of silly, isn't it? But for me, the story of God fishing and the story of the Breitbart reporter helps me to find hope in unexpected places, in places of humor and creative nonviolence. For God has already defeated the powers of death. God did it in the most unexpected ways, by going through death on a cross and resurrecting to offer peace. Or as the early Christians put it, God went fishing. And so as we continue our work for a more just world, may we do some fishing of our own. May we laugh as we find a sense of humor in unexpected places. And may we relax, knowing that Christ has been victorious over the forces of evil and death, making us one with God and with one another. Amen.
Hi everyone, this is Adam Erickson, reminding you that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome at Clackamas United Church of Christ. We are located at 15303 Southeast Webster Road in Milwaukee, Oregon. Our worship service starts at 10:30 on Sundays, except for during the summer months we start at 10 o'clock. If you'd like more information on our church, you can visit our Facebook page or our website at c-ucc.org. You can also reach out to me through email at adam@c-ucc.org. Until next time, grace and peace be with you.